A hand always tells the truth. Eleanor Sinclair believed that the way other women believed in Scripture, and she had reason to, for it was the last thing her grandfather taught her before the cold took him, and it was the only inheritance he had to leave. So on the gray October morning, the house at Wexmoor first looked her over and found her wanting. She stood at the foot of the great staircase with her chin level and let it. "This is the new governess," the housekeeper said to no one in particular, and a lady on the landing above, in a gown the color of crushed plums, looked down the length of Eleanor and said, "Is it?" not as a question, and turned away before the answer could climb the stairs to reach her. Eleanor did not flush. She had learned in the 7 years since the law stationer's shop was sold out from under her to pay a debt that was not hers, that a poor woman who flushed was simply giving the room the satisfaction it had come for. So she kept her hands folded, and her back straight, and her eyes on the small, worn brass reading glass that hung on a black ribbon at her breast, the one object in the world that was truly her own. And she breathed, slow and even, and she waited to be told where she might sleep. The candle on the side table had not been snuffed, for the morning came thin and late through the tall windows, and the marble hall held a pale, milk-colored light, and in that small living flame she watched her own reflection go very still. She was 24. She had 11 shillings, a box of books, a black ribbon, and a glass. And she had walked the last 6 miles of the carrier's road on foot, because the fare to the gate was a luxury she could not justify. And her boots had let in the wet, and not one soul in that great bright hall would ever know it, because she would die before she let them. That was the morning it began, but the truth of it had begun a great deal earlier, in a narrow shop that smelled of ink and hot wax, and the particular dust of old paper, where a girl too small to see over the counter had been lifted onto a high stool and handed a magnifying glass and told to look. "Tell me what the hand is doing, Nell," her grandfather would say, sliding a document across the worn deal counter, and she would bend over it with the whole gravity of her 6 years and study the loops and the pressure and the way the ink pooled at the turns. The shop was called Sinclair and Son, though the son had gone to sea and not come back, and so it was Sinclair and granddaughter in everything but the painted sign. They engrossed deeds and copied wills and ruled ledgers and witnessed signatures for half the attorneys in the county, and the work taught Eleanor a thing that she would carry like a stone in her pocket for the rest of her life, that a man's handwriting is the most honest thing about him, more honest than his face, more honest than his word, because the hand does not know how to lie even when the mouth has made a career of it. A forger could copy the shape of a name. He could not copy the speed of it, the unconscious pressure of a downstroke, the habit of a man who always lifted his pen a hair's breadth before the final letter. "The shape is the costume," her grandfather said, tapping the glass. "The pressure is the man." She was 9 when she could tell a true hand from a copied one across a room. She was 12 when an attorney, half in jest, set 3 signatures before her and asked which was the forgery, and she touched the middle one without hesitation, and the man stopped laughing and looked at her grandfather and said, "Good God, Sinclair." And her grandfather only smiled and said, "I know." She did not know then that the skill which made her a marvel in a backstreet shop would make her dangerous in a great house. She did not know that there was a kind of person, comfortable and well-fed and certain of their place, for whom a poor woman who could read the truth off a page was not a marvel at all, but a problem. She would learn. The housekeeper, whose name was Mrs. Dunmore, and whose kindness was the cautious, rationed kindness of a servant who has seen many governesses come and go, led her up the back stairs and along a cold corridor to a small room under the eaves, plainly furnished, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a single window that looked out over the stable yard. "His Grace keeps a quiet house," Mrs. Dunmore said, which Eleanor would come to understand was both a description and a warning. You will take your meals in the schoolroom. You will not be sent for in the evenings. The family does not—" She paused, choosing the word with care. "Mix. You will find it dull. Dull is the best you can hope for here, and I'd hold on to it with both hands if I were you." Eleanor thanked her, and meant it, and when the door closed, she sat down on the edge of the narrow bed and unwrapped her grandfather's reading glass from the square of flannel she kept it in, and held it up to the window light, and turned it until the world on the far side of it swam huge and clear. It was a good glass, ground true, the brass worn smooth and warm from 60 years of his thumb, and now 7 of hers. It had read 10,000 hands. It had earned 3 generations their bread. And it was, she thought, the only thing in this whole cold pile of stone that knew what she was actually worth, which was a great deal more than the lady in the plum-colored gown would ever guess, and a great deal less than she would one day be forced to prove. She did not weep. She had learned long ago that a Sinclair who wept in a strange house simply made the strange house feel it had been generous to take her in. So she breathed, and she settled, and she began to make the small, bare room her own. The house she had come to was the seat of the Dukes of Wexmoor, and it was older and colder and prouder than anything Eleanor had imagined a building could be. A long, pale Palladian front, with 2 wings folded back, like the arms of a man who does not wish to be embraced. The wards she had been hired to teach were not the Duke's own, for the Duke had none. They belonged to his late brother, and they were in the keeping of the house while their affairs were settled, and Eleanor's task was their books and their letters and their hours, which suited her, for she liked the young and the young on the whole, liked her, finding in her a brisk, straight calm that the great houses bred out of their own. But the household above the schoolroom was another country, and it had a sovereign, and his name was spoken in the corridors, the way a sore tooth is touched with the tongue, carefully, and not often. Adrian Thornycroft, the 6th Duke of Wexmoor, was 36 years old, and had been master of the house for 2 years, since his elder brother died. And in those 2 years he had given exactly 3 dinners, attended none of the counties, and acquired throughout the district the reputation of a man who held himself above his neighbors because he could no longer bear to be seen. For the Duke walked with a cane, a fall, 8 years past, on a horse that should have known better, and a master who should have, had broken his leg in 2 places, and it had set wrong, and it had left him with a slow, uneven gait, and a stiffness that no amount of breeding could disguise. And he had decided, Eleanor would learn this slowly, in pieces, over many weeks, that a man who limps before people who are waiting to pity him is a man who has handed them a weapon, and he would not hand them one. So he kept to his library, and his land, and his quiet, and the county called him cold, and the ton, when it troubled to speak of him at all, called him worse, and his cousin, who had a use for the word, called him broken. Eleanor saw him first, on her 4th day. She had taken her charges out across the east lawn for air, and they had run ahead of her toward the ha-ha, and she had turned at a sound and seen, on the gravel walk by the yew hedge, a tall man, standing very still, leaning on a plain, dark cane, watching the children with an expression she could not at first read, and then, with a small shock, did read, because she had spent her life reading what people did not wish to be seen feeling. It was not pity on his face, and it was not boredom, and it was certainly not the cold the county loved to ascribe to him. It was hunger, plain, and starved, and instantly mastered. The look of a man watching, through a window, a warmth he has decided he is not permitted to come in out of the rain toward. He saw her see it. That was the thing. For one bare, unguarded second, their eyes met across the green, and she watched him understand that she had read him, and she watched the shutter come down, the cool, blank courtesy folding back over the face like a sheet drawn over furniture in a closed room. And he inclined his head a precise half-inch, and turned, and went, his cane finding the gravel in its slow, particular rhythm. And Eleanor stood with her heart going hard, and thought, with the part of her that never stopped working, that she had just been taught more about the master of Wexmoor in 1 second than the whole household had learned in 2 years, and that he knew it, and that it would not be forgiven quickly. She was right about that. She was wrong about the shape the unforgiveness would take. Because the Duke of Wexmoor did not punish her for seeing him. He began, instead, to seek her out, in the small, starved, careful way of a man who has forgotten how, and that, not her poverty, not her plainness, not her place at the foot of the great stair, was the thing that would nearly destroy her. For a duke may look where he likes, and the world will only smile. But let him look twice at a portionless governess in gray, and the world stops smiling, and begins, very quietly, to sharpen its knives. Let me stop here a moment, before the knives come out, because some of you already know exactly the shape of what I am describing. If you have ever been the plainly dressed person in a bright room full of people who decided your worth before you had said a single word, if you have ever stood very straight and kept your hands folded and let a room be cruel to you because flinching would only have fed it, if you have ever carried in a pocket or in your chest the one true thing you knew yourself to be, while a whole comfortable world insisted you were less, then you already belong here, and you should take a moment to subscribe, because the overlooked one quietly proven right is the only kind of story I tell on this channel, and I would very much like you with me when this one turns. And it does turn. Hold on to that. Now, the Duke began to seek her out. It was done so carefully, with so much practiced indirection, that for a fortnight, Eleanor told herself she was imagining it, because the alternative was a thing too dangerous to hold in the mind of a woman in her position. But she was not a woman who could lie to herself for long. The same eye that read a forger's pressure read her own, and the evidence accumulated the way evidence does, one quiet entry at a time. The library, which the children used for their lessons on wet mornings, began to be occupied when she arrived, the Duke at the long table with a book he did not seem to be reading, who rose with his slow, stiff courtesy and said he was just leaving, and did not leave. The east lawn, where she walked her charges, acquired a man with a cane on its far gravel path, with a frequency that the weather did not explain. A question would be put to her, gravely, across the width of a room. What was she reading the children? Did she find the north light sufficient? Had the schoolroom fire been seen to? Small questions. The questions of a man reaching across a frozen river toward a fire on the far bank and pretending he was only testing the ice. And Eleanor, who had every reason in the world to retreat behind the wall of her station and answer in the flat short syllables that would have ended it, found that she could not quite do it because the man on the far bank was not what the county said he was. And she knew it. And it is a hard thing to be cruel to a person precisely because they have shown you, by accident, the warmth they keep hidden. So she answered him, truly, and a little longer than she needed to, and once, God help her, with a dry observation about a passage of Mr. Gibbon that made the corner of his mouth move, just perceptibly, the first crack in 2 years of held stone, and she saw it, and he saw her see it, and they both looked away at once like two people who have touched a hot surface. It was nothing. It was a governess and a master, exchanging 4 sentences about a dead historian across a cold library. And it was the most that either of them had said to another living soul in longer than either would have confessed. And the house, which had eyes in every wall, did not fail to notice. The first to notice, and the most dangerous, was the lady in the plum-colored gown. Her name was Lavinia Marsh, and she was the Duke's cousin, the daughter of his late father's younger sister. And she had come to Wexmoor 2 months before Eleanor, ostensibly to keep the house company in its mourning. In truth, because Lavinia Marsh had spent a comfortable life on the outer edge of a great fortune, and had decided, with the cold patience of a woman who has counted every door she was not quite grand enough to walk through, that the edge was no longer enough. She was a handsome woman, of perhaps 35, with pale, hooded eyes, and a soft, pleasant voice that never rose and never warmed, and she had understood the Duke's situation faster and more clearly than the Duke himself. He was unmarried. He was unwell, the county said, growing strange and reclusive, no heir of his body, and no prospect of one. His late brother's wards were no blood claim on the dukedom, and the next male of the Wexmoor line, after Adrian, by a path that Lavinia had traced through the family tree, the way a surveyor traces a boundary he means to move, was Lavinia's own brother, a vague, biddable man named Hector Marsh, who lived on his cousin's sufferance in a damp house in the next county and did precisely what his sister told him. The whole of Wexmoor, its lands and its rents and its name, stood between Lavinia Marsh and a single inconvenient life, the life of the cold, lame, solitary man in the library. She had not, when Eleanor arrived, yet decided what to do about that life. She was still, that October, in the patient reconnoitering phase of her ambition, taking the measure of the ground. But she knew with absolute certainty what she did not want, and what she did not want was for the Duke of Wexmoor to develop an attachment to anyone, to a suitable lady of the county least of all, but to a portionless governess in gray most insultingly of all. Because an attachment leads to a marriage, and a marriage leads to a wife, and a wife, however poor, however plain, leads with terrible reliability to a son, and a son would close the road Lavinia had spent 2 months opening. So when Lavinia Marsh, passing the library door on a wet morning, heard the Duke of Wexmoor laugh, a short rusty sound, almost disused, but unmistakably a laugh, at something the governess had said, she stopped in the corridor, and her pleasant face did not change at all, and she stood there for a moment, listening to a thing she had been certain could not happen. And then she walked on, and by luncheon she had begun, very quietly, in the soft, unhurried voice that never warmed, to take that governess apart. It was a campaign conducted entirely in things that could not be objected to. A governess could not complain that her name was spoken kindly. Lavinia spoke Eleanor's name kindly to everyone. To Mrs. Dunmore, to the visiting rector and his wife, to the 2 or 3 county families grand enough to be admitted to the house in its half-mourning. Always kindly, always with a small, worried softness, the voice of a woman defending a person she could not quite defend. Miss Sinclair manages the children wonderfully, she would say, considering. One does not like to ask where she was before. There was some trouble, I understand, with a family business, a debt. But the past is the past, and she is so very devoted, and after all His Grace does seem to find her conversation a comfort, which is a mercy in his state. And she would smile, and the listener would go away, having been handed 3 knives wrapped in a handkerchief. That Eleanor came from disgrace, that she was angling at a sick man, and that the Duke himself was an object of pity not quite sound in his mind. None of it was a lie outright. All of it was a lie entire. And it spread the way that kind of thing always spreads, faster and farther than any plain accusation. Because a plain accusation can be answered, and an insinuation cannot. And within 3 weeks, Eleanor Sinclair, who had spoken to perhaps 6 people outside the schoolroom, found that a whole county she had never met had formed a settled opinion of her, and that the opinion was contempt. She felt it first at church. The Wexmoor pew was at the front, and the governess sat at the back with the upper servants, which was as it should be, and troubled her not at all. But she became aware, in the weeks after Lavinia began her work, of a quality in the glances that found her in the churchyard after the service, a cool appraising slide of the eyes from her worn bonnet to her mended gloves and back to her face, and a particular way the county ladies had of falling silent as she passed and resuming lower when she had. She knew the look. She had worn its object all her life. It was the look that says, "We know what you are, and what you are is a woman reaching above herself, and we will enjoy, in a Christian and well-bred way, watching you fall." The rector's wife, a Mrs. Pelletier, broad and certain and built like the lich gate she stood beside, took it upon herself one Sunday to be kind, which is the cruelest thing that kind of woman does. A word, Miss Sinclair, from one who means you well. She clasped Eleanor's hand in both of hers, on the church path, in full view. A young woman in your position cannot be too careful of appearances. His Grace is good to take an interest, but interest from a gentleman of his rank in a person of yours is never read the way it is meant. And it is you, my dear, not he, who will pay for the reading. Keep to your schoolroom. Count your blessings. There is no shame in a small life honestly held, and a great deal of shame in reaching for a larger one, and being seen to drop it. Eleanor stood very still and let the words land. Everyone. And when the woman had finished, she said in a voice perfectly level, "Thank you for your concern, ma'am. I keep to my schoolroom. I have reached for nothing." Which was true, and which the rector's wife heard as insolence, because a poor woman who answers a lecture with a straight back has not learned her place. And the report that went round that week was that the Wexmoor governess was proud. And proud was the worst thing a portionless woman could be. And the knives, which had been whispers, began to be something nearer to a verdict. Through all of it, the Duke did the one thing guaranteed to make it worse. He did not stop. He could not have failed to know. A man does not reach 36 in that world without learning exactly how it punishes. And Eleanor came to understand that his persistence was not blindness, but a kind of grim, deliberate defiance. The defiance of a man who has spent 8 years being quietly written off, and has decided that he will be damned before he lets the same machine that diminished him diminish the one person who had looked at him and seen a man instead of a wound. He began to send books up to the schoolroom, by a footman, without a note, books she had mentioned wanting. She sent them back down read, with a single line of dry comment on a slip of paper, which was as far as either of them would let it go, and which was a correspondence as surely as if they had written pages. At the one dinner the house gave that autumn, to which the governess was of course not invited, he had a plate sent up to her with a particular dish she had once said her grandfather favored, a thing she had told a child at a lesson and not known he overheard, and she sat alone in the cold schoolroom and looked at it for a long time before she could eat it, because no one in 7 years had done her a kindness that cost them anything, and this one had cost him a great deal more than a plate. And once, only once, that autumn, they were alone, truly alone, by accident, in the long gallery at dusk, she having come to fetch a child's forgotten shawl, and he having come for the quiet, and they stood at the cold window with the park going blue below them, and the first candle of the evening unlit in its sconce, and he said, without looking at her, in a low, even voice, "They are unkind to you, on my account. I am aware of it. I find I do not know how to stop it without making it worse, which is the particular helplessness of my whole life, and I am sorry for it." And Eleanor, looking out at the same blue park, said, "You need not be. I have been disliked by better houses than this, for worse reasons than a kind man's conversation. I find I do not regret the conversation." A brief silence. The park went a shade darker, and he said, very low, "No, nor I." And that was all. And it was everything. And they stood another minute in the blue dark, not touching and not speaking, and both of them more frightened of that single shared minute than either had been of anything the county could do. And then she fetched the shawl and went, and the thing between them, unspoken, unacted, impossible, was none the less now a fact in the world, and facts, as her grandfather had taught her, do not bend. Lavinia Marsh understood that a fact had been established. She did not know its content. No one had seen the gallery. No word had been said that a wall could carry. But she had the instinct of her kind for the moment, when an insinuation is no longer enough, and she felt that moment arrive, that autumn, like a change in the weather. Slander would keep the governess in her place. Slander would not remove her. There was, that winter, one bright public hour in which the whole of it, the looking, the sneering, the impossible warmth between a duke and a governess, was forced for a single evening into the open, and it was the thing the county would speak of longest. It was the assembly at the county town, the great winter ball the gentry held each year in the long upper rooms above the corn exchange, and the household of Wexmoor was expected, in its half-mourning, to make at least an appearance, and the Duke, who had not danced in 8 years and had not been seen at a public assembly in nearly as long, astonished everyone by saying he would go. He took the ward's governess in the carriage, with Mrs. Dunmore for propriety, because the children had begged that Miss Sinclair see the lights, and there was no other lady of the house who would trouble to chaperone a servant's outing. Lavinia had pleaded a headache, the better to be absent from a triumph she did not yet know she would need to prevent. And so Eleanor Sinclair, in the one good gown she owned, a plain dark silk turned and retrimmed by her own hand, with her grandfather's glass left at home for once, and a borrowed pair of gloves, walked up the assembly stairs into a blaze of candlelight and 100 curious, cool faces, and stood at the edge of the room where governesses stood, by the wall, near the chaperones and the spinsters, and watched the county dance, and was content to, for she had not come for herself. The room knew who she was within the quarter hour. The soft work of a winter slander had done its office, and the glances found her by the wall and slid over her and away, and the county ladies arranged themselves so that their shoulders made a wall of their own between the bright floor and the gray woman beside it, and Eleanor stood in the small, cold pocket of contempt they made for her, and kept her chin level, and her face pleasant, and felt, not for the first time in her life, entirely invisible, in a blaze of light. And then the music ended, and the floor cleared for the next, and across the whole length of that bright crowded room, the Duke of Wexmoor, who had sat the evening out by the card-room door with his cane and his cool, unreadable courtesy, rose and came. He came slowly. He came the whole length of the room, his uneven step loud in the lull between dances, every eye in the assembly turning to follow the strange progress of the lame recluse, who never danced, and the county watched him cross the floor with a held collective breath, certain he was making for some lady of rank by the far wall. And he walked past them all, past the daughters of every good family in the district arranged in their silks, and he stopped in front of the governess by the chaperone's wall, and he bowed, fully, gravely, as a man bows to a woman he honors, and he said, in a voice pitched to carry exactly far enough, "Miss Sinclair, will you do me the honor?" It was not a question. It was a declaration in a question shape, and the whole room heard it as such, and the whole room understood, in the space of that bow, that everything the winter had whispered was true, and that the Duke of Wexmoor did not care who knew it, and a sound went round the assembly like wind through dry grass. Eleanor looked up at him. She knew exactly what he was doing, and exactly what it would cost her. That to dance with him here, before all of them, was to hand the county its proof, to be forever after the governess who had reached. She knew the safe thing, the thing 7 years of being poor had trained into her bones, was to murmur that she did not dance, and keep her place by the wall, and give them nothing. And she knew, looking at him, that he had counted that cost too, on her behalf and his own, and had decided to pay it anyway, in the open, because he would not let the room go on pretending she was beneath his notice when she was, in fact, the whole of it, and that he had left it to her, in the end, to choose, the way he always left her the choice. So she stood, and she put her hand in his, and she let the Duke of Wexmoor lead her out into the middle of the bright floor in front of the entire county, and they danced, slowly, for his leg would not allow otherwise, a grave, deliberate measure that took no notice of the quicker music, two people moving at their own pace in the center of a room that had stopped to stare. And he was not graceful, and she did not care, and they did not speak, and her hand rested in his and his at her back, and they turned, slow and unhurried and entirely unashamed, through a silence that should have been the most humiliating of her life, and was instead, against every rule she had ever lived by, the proudest, because for the length of that one dance, she was not invisible, and she was not contemptible, and she was not less. She was simply, openly, in the full blaze of the candlelight, A woman, a good man, had crossed a whole room to choose. They would pay for it. She knew that, even as they turned. But some things, her grandfather had taught her, are true regardless of the cost of saying them, and worth the saying for that alone. And when the measure ended, he bowed again, and led her back to her place by the wall, and the county found its tongue, and its outrage, and the report of it was over the whole district by the next noon. And it reached Lavinia Marsh in her headache's darkened room, the news that her lame cousin had stood up before the entire assembly, and danced with the portionless governess, and as good as announced her to the world. And Lavinia lay very still, and listened to it, and understood with a cold clarity that was the truest thing about her, that the slow, patient road was finished. And Lavinia had begun, by then, to understand that she required the Duke not merely to remain unmarried, but to be gone, that the slow, patient road through the family tree was too slow, that a man of 36 might marry yet, might mend, might in a single reckless season undo 2 months of careful surveying. And so, the ambition that had been content to wait for nature began, in the soft, unhurried privacy of Lavinia's mind, to consider helping nature along. For that, she would need more than a whispering tongue. She would need a document. And in the muniment room of Wexmoor, in an iron strongbox to which the family solicitor held one key and the Duke held the other, there were a great many documents, and Lavinia Marsh had begun, very pleasantly, over many small cups of tea, to befriend the family solicitor. The solicitor was a Mr. Crail, of the firm of Crail and Whitby, of the county town, a thin, gray, precise man of 60, who had served the Wexmoor estate for 30 years, and who had, in the last of those years, made the single error that ruins precise men. He had speculated. A canal scheme, a railway that was never built, a parcel of bad shares bought against a mortgage on his own house. The details did not matter, only the sum, which was large, and the fact, which was that Mr. Crail, the keeper of the family's secrets and the holder of one of the 2 keys to its strongbox, was quietly, privately, and catastrophically in debt, and lived each quarter day in terror of the post. Lavinia Marsh had a nose for that terror. She had smelt it on people all her life. It was the scent of the only currency she had ever truly possessed, which was leverage. And over the course of that long gray autumn, in a series of conversations so gentle and so gradual that Mr. Crail himself could not afterward have said when the line was crossed, she made him an offer that resolved his terror entirely, and required of him only that he assist in the correction of what she described, with her soft, unwarming smile, as an oversight in the affairs of the family. The late Duke, Adrian's father, had been, Lavinia explained, a man of strong and particular wishes, and it was a great pity that his true and final wishes had never been properly drawn. She had it on the best authority, her own, that the old Duke had meant at the end to provide far more handsomely for his sister's line, for Lavinia and her brother Hector, who'd been so cruelly overlooked. He had meant to. He had said as much, to her, privately, before he died. The tragedy was merely that he had died before a document could be made to reflect it. And surely, Lavinia suggested, pouring the tea, it could be no great sin. Could it, Mr. Crail, and a man of conscience, to repair on paper an injustice that had only failed of being done on paper by the cruel accident of a single missed week? Mr. Crail knew exactly what she was asking. He was a precise man. He did not misunderstand. What she was asking was for a will to be made. A will of the old Duke's, dated before his death, witnessed, sealed, leaving the bulk of the Wexmoor estate not to his living son Adrian, but, through a careful tangle of trusts and entails that only a solicitor could have devised, to the Marsh line, and for that will, which had never existed, to be discovered now, in the strongbox, among the old Duke's papers, where it might have lain unnoticed these 2 years. He knew it was forgery. He knew it was a crime that would hang a poorer man and ruin a richer one. And he knew with the cold clarity of the cornered, that the sum Lavinia offered would clear his debt and save his house, and let him die a respected man in his own bed, instead of a bankrupt in a sponging house, and that the only life it cost was the life of a cold, lame duke whom nobody liked and nobody would miss, and who, the county already said, was not quite right in his head. So Mr. Crail, who had kept the Wexmoor secrets honestly for 30 years, took out, on a winter evening, a sheet of paper of the right age. There was old blank stock in the muniment room, the genuine article, decades old, and a pot of ink he had mixed to look older than it was. And he began, slowly, in a hand that was not his own, to write a dead man's last wishes as a living woman dictated them. He was good. He had seen the old duke's signature 10,000 times. He copied its shape exactly. And there, precisely, in the one thing he could copy, and the several things he could not, the whole future of the story was already written, though no one yet alive could read it, but a governess in a room under the eaves who had not yet been shown the page. The will surfaced in February. It was done, when it was done, with great ceremony and greater grief, which is how the best lies are always done. Mr. Crail came to the house with a face of professional sorrow, and asked for a private audience with the Duke, and emerged from it gray and shaken, and what he had laid upon the library table, he said, he had found while at last completing the late Duke's papers, in a sealed packet at the bottom of the strong-box, overlooked these 2 years, and he had not slept since, and he did not know how to say it, but the law was the law, and a man of his profession could not suppress a testament, however much he might wish to. There existed a later will, a will the present Duke had never seen, a will, signed and witnessed and sealed in the old Duke's own hand and stamp, that left Wexmoor, the house, the land, the name, all of it that was not nailed down by the strictest entail, to Hector Marsh. The household heard of it within the hour, because Lavinia made certain it did, with every appearance of being as stunned and as grieved as anyone, and the news went down through the house and out across the county like cold water finding every crack, and it reached the schoolroom under the eaves, where Eleanor Sinclair sat with her charges' copybooks, and she set down her pen, and she felt, before she knew anything at all, the particular stillness that came over her when the world was about to require the only thing she truly had. If you've made it this far into Eleanor's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. What happened next was that the Duke of Wexmoor, who had borne the loss of his health and his brother and his good name in the county with the same locked, unbreakable composure, came as near to breaking as Eleanor would ever see him, and that he came, in his breaking, to her. He did not send a footman. He came himself, that evening, up the back stairs that a duke had no business climbing, his cane loud on the bare treads in the quiet, and he knocked at the schoolroom door. And when she opened it, he stood in the cold corridor, with a single candle in his hand, and a face she had never seen him wear, the locked composure gone, and under it something raw and bewildered and very young. "Forgive me," he said. "I have no right to be here. I did not know where else." He stopped. He was a man who had not asked anyone for anything in 8 years, and had forgotten the words. "They are saying my father disinherited me. There is a will. Crail has it. It is in my father's hand, and his seal, and I am to be turned out of the only house I have ever—" He stopped again. "I do not understand it. He loved me. Whatever else, he loved me. I would stake my life on it. And they are telling me he signed his name to my ruin and hid it in a box for me to find when he was past my asking why. And I find I cannot bear it alone, and you are the only person in this house who has ever looked at me as though I were a man and not a misfortune. And I am sorry. I am profoundly sorry. But I had to tell someone the truth of it before the whole world tells me a lie about my own father." Eleanor looked at him standing there, with his candle and his grief, and she did the thing she would do, in one form or another, for the rest of her life with this man. She gave him, instead of comfort, the truth. "Then let me see it," she said. He blinked. "See it? The will, the document. Let me see the actual page, Your Grace, with my own eyes, before either of us believes a word of what we are told it says." And something in the steadiness of it, the sheer practical impudence of a governess proposing to examine a duke's stolen birthright as though it were a child's blotted exercise, reached him through the grief, and he looked at her a long moment in the candlelight. And he said, slowly, "Why?" And Eleanor Sinclair told him for the first time who she was. Not the disgrace, not the debt, not the sold shop. The thing under all of it. "Because my grandfather was a law stationer," she said, "and before that, his father, and they engrossed and copied and witnessed the legal papers of half a county for 60 years, and they raised me to it from the age I could hold a glass. I have read 10,000 hands, Your Grace. I was made to. It is the one thing in this world I can do that no lady of your county can do, and no clerk of Mr. Crale's can do. And I will tell you what my grandfather told me, which is the truest thing I know. A hand always tells the truth. A man may copy the shape of a name. He cannot copy the man. If your father signed that will, I will see your father in every stroke of it. And I will tell you so. And you may grieve him honestly. And if he did not, if some other hand made that name, then I will see the other hand, as surely as you would see a stranger wearing your father's coat, and I will tell you that. And then, Your Grace, we shall not be grieving. We shall be at war." There was a silence in the cold corridor. The candle flame stood straight, and the Duke of Wexmoor, who had come up those stairs a broken man looking for a place to lay his grief, looked at the gray-eyed governess in the doorway, and felt, for the first time in 8 years, something he had thought permanently burned out of him, which was hope, and he said, very quietly, "Then you shall see it. God help me, you shall see it tonight." Getting it was not simple, for the will lay now in Mr. Crale's keeping, and Mr. Crale guarded it like the salvation it was. But the Duke was still master of Wexmoor until a court said otherwise, and there were copies. Crale, being precise even in his crime, had made an attested copy for the family, and lodged the original with the firm, and the attested copy was in the library, and to the library, at midnight, by the light of a branch of candles, the Duke of Wexmoor brought Eleanor Sinclair, and laid the document before her, and stood back, gripping his cane, and watched. She did not touch it at first. She stood over it, and looked, the way her grandfather had taught her, taking the whole page before any part of it, the proportion, the spacing, the weight of the paper, the color of the ink, the lie of the lines. Then she unwound the brass reading glass from the ribbon at her throat, the warm, worn glass that had read 10,000 hands, and she bent to the page, and the great coal library held its breath around the two of them, and Eleanor began to read the will the way she had been born to read it, which was not for what it said, but for what it could not help confessing. And here is the thing that you must understand, the thing the whole county, and the clever Mr. Crale, and the patient Lavinia Marsh had all forgotten or never known. A forgery is not a single lie. It is 100 lies, and they must all agree, and they never quite do. The shape of the signature was perfect. Crale had earned his fee there. Had Eleanor seen only the name, she might have wept with the Duke and called it true. But she did not see only the name. She saw the paper, and the paper was genuine old stock. Yes, decades old. She could feel the rag of it. But the watermark, when she lifted the page to the candle and looked through it with the glass, the maker's mark pressed into the very fiber of the sheet, was a mark she knew, because a law stationer's granddaughter knows her papermakers the way a sailor knows stars, and it was a mark that the mill had not begun to use until 4 years after the old Duke was in his grave. The paper was old. The watermark was new. And a dead man cannot have written his will on a paper that would not exist for 4 years after he died. Eleanor straightened. She did not speak at once. She had learned in the shop never to announce a finding until she had tested it against everything that might overthrow it, because a forger's best defense is an examiner who cries out too soon. And so she went back to the page, slow and cold and methodical, and she found the rest of it, one quiet lie at a time. The ink. She wet the tip of her smallest finger and touched it very lightly to the foot of a downstroke in a corner, where no eye would think to look, and rubbed, and looked at her fingertip through the glass, and the brown of it came away faintly gray at the edge. The particular treachery of an iron gall ink that has been aged in a hurry, browned with something added, rather than browned by 20 honest years on a shelf. True old ink does not surrender its color to a damp finger. It has bitten too deep into the rag, and this ink sat on the surface of the paper, like a guest who has not been asked to stay. The seal! She bent to the red wax at the foot of the last sheet, the old Duke's seal pressed deep and proud, and she studied the device in it through the glass. The Wexmoor arms, a stag's head over a tower, and it was very fine, and it was very nearly right, and it was wrong, because the matrix that had stamped it was not the old Duke's signet, but a newer cutting of the same arms, and she knew it was newer because the engraver, recutting the stag, had given it 5 tines to the antler, where the true and ancient Wexmoor stag, the one on the gateposts, and the church monument, and the very spoons in the house, had always borne 6. The forger had copied the picture and miscounted the points of a deer. And last, and worst for the men who had made it, the witnesses. 2 names subscribed the will beneath the old Duke's, in 2 different hands, as the law required, and one of them Eleanor did not know and could not test, but the other was a name the household spoke, for it was the name of the old Duke's steward of that time, a man named Bellamy, and Eleanor had heard from Mrs. Dunmore in the long gossip of the servants' hall, the small, proud tragedy of the Wexmoor stewards, that old Bellamy had gone out to the West Indies in the family's interest, to a sugar property the estate held there. In the spring of the year the old Duke died, and had taken the fever, and was buried in Jamaica, and had been at sea, or in his far grave for the whole of the season, in which this will claimed his living signature. A witness must be present. A witness must sign. And a witness who is 3,000 miles across an ocean, or under the red earth of another hemisphere, signs nothing. It is a forgery, Eleanor said at last, into the enormous silence of the library, and her voice did not shake, because the page had taken all the doubt out of her. Your father never saw this. Your father never touched this. The paper is 4 years too young. The ink is dressed to look old and is not. The seal is cut wrong by a tine, and one of the men who swore he watched your father sign it had been dead in Jamaica for half a year, when he is said to have held the pen. I do not think your father disinherited you, your grace. I think someone needed you gone, and bought a frightened man to make the door, and did it well enough to fool a county and a court, and every clever person in this house. Every clever person but one. And the Duke of Wexmoor stood in the candlelight and looked at the gray woman who had just handed him back his father, and his name, and his whole life. And he did not speak, because there are no words built for that moment. And instead, he did a thing that undid them both. He crossed the room with his slow, uneven step, and he took her hand, the hand that still held the glass, and he bowed his head over it, not kissing it, only holding it, his forehead nearly to her knuckles, like a man at an altar. And he breathed once, raggedly, and Eleanor stood very still and let him, and felt the warmth of his bent head against her cold fingers, and understood that whatever happened now, whatever the county said, and the court ruled, and the world decided a portionless governess was worth. This exact unbearable minute in the cold, bright library was hers, and could not be forged, and could not be taken, and was the truest thing that had ever happened to her. They did not speak of love. They were neither of them people who could, not yet, not with a forged will between them and a county at the door. But that night, the Duke did, at last, the thing he had never done for anyone. He told her his own truth, plainly, as a list of facts. The way her grandfather had taught her the truth was best told. He told her of the fall, and the wrong set bone, and the year he had spent learning to walk like a stranger in his own body. He told her of his brother, whom he had loved, and the grief of him. He told her of the slow education of being pitied, and the day he had decided he would rather be thought cold than be seen to be wounded, and how that decision had walled him into a solitude he no longer knew how to leave. And he showed her, from a locked drawer in the library desk, the one thing he had of his father's heart, a letter, real, genuine, the old Duke's true hand. And Eleanor took it under the glass at once, by instinct, and saw in 3 words that it was true, the true pressure, the true habit of the lifted pen, her grandfather's whole teaching confirming in an instant what a son had only been able to believe. A letter the old Duke had written his son Adrian a month before he died, that said, in the plain, gruff tenderness of a hard old man, that he was prouder of how his lame son bore his trouble than of anything his sound son had ever done easily, that Adrian was the truest Thornycroft of them all, and that the house, when it came to him, could not come to better hands. "Read it to me," the Duke said, his voice not steady. "In your voice. I have not been able to read it since he died." And Eleanor Sinclair sat in the cold library at 1 in the morning and read a dead father's love to his living son, slowly, in a clear, quiet voice, while the candles burned down, and somewhere above them, under the eaves, a schoolroom went unwatched, and a county slept certain of its verdict, and neither of them knew that 2 rooms away, in the dark, Lavinia Marsh had heard the Duke's loud cane on the back stairs hours before, and had drawn her own conclusions, and was already, in the soft, unhurried machinery of her mind, deciding that the governess, too, would now have to be removed, and that she knew exactly how. She moved within the week, and she moved, as she did everything, without raising her voice. She did not accuse Eleanor of anything so vulgar as theft. She let it be known to Mrs. Dunmore, to the rector's wife, to the very heir of the house, that she was distressed, deeply distressed, on the governess's own account, because the poor young woman had been seen, by a servant Lavinia would not name, leaving the library in the small hours of the morning in the company of his grace. And Lavinia did not for one moment suggest there had been impropriety. She was certain Miss Sinclair was a good girl, only that appearances were appearances, and that a Duke half out of his wits with grief over a will, alone at midnight with a portionless and ambitious young woman who stood to gain a very great deal indeed if she could attach herself to him before the estate was lost. Well, one did not like to think it, but others would think it, and had Miss Sinclair's interests truly at heart, and surely the kindest thing, the only proper thing, was for the young woman to be quietly let go, with a character, before the talk could ruin her entirely. It was perfect. It punished Eleanor for the one true and innocent thing she had done. It recast her midnight reading of the truth as a fortune hunter's midnight scheming. It used the Duke's own grief as proof of his unsoundness, building the competency case in the same breath that it destroyed the governess. And it could not be answered, because the only answer, that the 2 of them had spent that night proving the will a forgery, was the very thing Eleanor was not yet ready to say aloud. For she knew, the moment she revealed what she had found, the forgers would know precisely which threads to burn, and she had not yet secured a single one of her proofs beyond her own word, which was the word of a dismissed governess, with a grudge and a motive, against a respected solicitor, and a grieving cousin, and the seal of a dead duke. So Lavinia won the week. Eleanor was sent for, not by the duke, who was kept from her now by a household closing ranks, but by Mrs. Dunmore, whose cautious, rationed kindness had curdled into the frightened severity of a servant protecting her own place, and who could not meet her eye. "You're to go, Miss Sinclair. End of the month. There's a character written for you. A good one, her. Mrs. Marsh saw to it herself." A pause. "I'm sorry. I am. But this is a house with no master left to speak of. Near enough. And a woman in your place can't afford the talk, and neither can I. And that's the size of it." Eleanor took the character. She did not argue, because there was no one to argue to, and arguing would only have proved her proud, and proud was the verdict already passed. She went up to the small room under the eaves, and she sat on the narrow bed where she had sat on her first morning, and she unwrapped her grandfather's reading glass from its square of flannel, and she held it up to the window where the stable yard lay gray below, and she let herself, for one moment, feel the whole crushing size of it. She was 24. She had 11 shillings still, and a box of books, and a black ribbon, and a glass. And now a written character she had not earned in the way it implied, and could not use without choking. She had no family, and no home, and no place to go when the month turned, but the carrier's road she had come in on. And she had, locked behind her ribs where no one could subpoena it, the entire truth of the greatest crime the county had ever not known it harbored, the proof of a forgery that would restore a good man to his name and his house, and not one single way to make the world believe a word of it that would not be turned by clever, frightened people into further proof that she was exactly the grasping little schemer they had decided she was. This was the darkest hour, and I will not pretend to you that she came through it lightly, because she did not. She thought, that gray afternoon, of leaving, of taking the character and the carrier's road and vanishing into some other county and some other family's schoolroom, and never again, in her life, standing up in a bright room full of people who had decided her worth, of keeping her head down and her glass wrapped and her mouth shut, of the small, safe life the rector's wife had counseled, the life the whole world rewards. It would have been so easy. It is always so easy. And what stopped her was not love, though she loved him and not pride, though they had called her proud, and not even justice, though the injustice of it sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. What stopped her was a thing her grandfather had said to her once in the shop over a forged deed that a rich man had used to turn a poor family off a strip of land, a case they had proved, and that the magistrate, being the rich man's friend, had quietly let drop. She had asked him, a girl of 11, sick with the unfairness of it, why they bothered, why they read the truth off the page at all, if the world would only do as it pleased. And her grandfather had set down his glass and looked at her a long moment and said, "Because the truth is not less true for going unheard, Nell. A thing that is true if every soul on earth denies it. Our work is not to make the world believe. Our work is to know and to be ready to show, so that on the day the world is finally willing to look. And that day comes, child. It comes later than it should, and to fewer than it ought. But it comes. There is someone in the room who can hold the page up to the light and say, 'Here, look. This is what was always so.' Be that someone. It is the only thing I have to leave you, and it is worth more than the shop." Eleanor sat on the narrow bed with his glass warm in her hand, and his voice in her ears, and the stable yard going dark below, and she made her choice, and it was not the easy one. She would not run. She would stay to the end of the month as she had been bidden, meek and silent and apparently beaten, and she would use that month not to pack, but to gather, to fix every proof beyond the reach of a burning hand, to find the one ally a dismissed governess could not be denied, and to wait, patient and cold as a heron in the shallows, for the single moment when the whole county would be made, by its own appetite for the spectacle, to look at the page, for the will was to be read and proved publicly. Lavinia, in her confidence, had arranged it. A formal reading before the assembled gentry and the magistrate, a fortnight hence, in the great hall of Wexmoor, so that the transfer of the estate to Hector Marsh might be done with every appearance of law and daylight and consent. And the cold mad duke shuffled quietly aside. They had built a stage, they had summoned an audience, they had lit the room, and they had invited, without knowing it, the one person alive who could read what was written there, to stand in the back of it, dismissed and disgraced, and underestimated to the last, with her grandfather's glass in her pocket, and the truth held ready to the light. The fortnight she had been given to be defeated in, she spent instead becoming undefeatable, and she did it the way her grandfather had taught her, quietly, on paper, leaving nothing to her own unsupported word. She wrote letters. A governess might still write letters, and the post does not ask a woman's station. She wrote to the paper mill, whose mark she had read in the watermark, a respectable firm whose name was woven into the very sheet, and asked, in the dry, precise language of the trade she had been raised in what year their watermark of that particular dye had first been laid into their molds, and a clerk, having no notion why a Miss Sinclair of Wexmoor should care, wrote back the plain commercial fact, with a date on the firm's own headed paper, a date 4 years after the old duke's death, set down in writing by the very makers of the sheet. She wrote to the parish in Jamaica, where the steward Bellamy lay, and that answer would be long in coming. Too long for the day. But she did not need the colony when she had the county, for the estate's own paybooks, which the duke commanded be brought to her, showed Bellamy's passage paid and his wages stopped, and the small black entry of his death, all of it in Wexmoor's own honest ledgers, proving the man an ocean away, and then under the earth on the very day the will swore, he had stood in the old duke's study, with a pen in his hand. And she found, in the muniment room, with the duke's key, a thing better than any letter, an old document, genuine, indisputable, that the true ancient Wexmoor signet had stamped in the old duke's own lifetime, the 6-tined stag pressed clean and proud in honest wax, so that she might lay the true seal beside the forged one, and let any eye in the room, however unschooled, count for itself the points of a deer. She gathered it all, and she made fair copies, and she lodged the originals where no frightened hand could reach them in the night, with a country attorney 2 villages off who had once bought paper from her grandfather and remembered the old man kindly, and asked no questions of the granddaughter who came to him with a sealed packet and a request that he keep it safe and say nothing. And then she waited. The day came bright. They had chosen the great hall of Wexmoor, the high, cold marble hall with the great staircase where Eleanor had stood on her first morning and been found wanting, and they had filled it, the county gentry in their best, the rector and his certain wife, the magistrate Sir Hugo Pennant, grave upon a chair set like a small throne, Mr. Crail precise in gray behind a table with the dreadful document upon it, and Lavinia Marsh in plum-colored silk at the front, serene, gracious, her brother Hector blinking beside her in a new coat, the very picture of a family come modestly into its own. The Duke of Wexmoor was there, of course, set somewhat apart, watched, the cane conspicuous, the household's pity and the county's curiosity upon him in equal measure, a man being shuffled with great courtesy toward the door of his own house. And at the very back, among the upper servants and the lesser tenants, in her plain charcoal gray dress with a black ribbon at her throat, dismissed and disgraced, and entirely beneath the notice of the bright assembly, stood the governess, with her hands folded and her back straight, and her grandfather's glass in her pocket, and not one soul in that hall. But the Duke knew she was anything at all. Mr. Crail read the will. He read it in his dry, precise voice, the whole sad, lying length of it, and the hall listened in the hush that great sums command. And when he came to the end, to the old Duke's forged name, and the dead man's borrowed signature, and the seal with one tine too few, he set it down, and Sir Hugo Pennant cleared his throat to pronounce the thing proved and the estate conveyed, and into that breath, that single-held breath, before a county's whole future was to be signed away on a lie, the Duke of Wexmoor stood up, and leaning on his cane, in a voice gone hard and clear, and carrying as Eleanor had never heard it, said, "Before the magistrate rules, there is a person in this hall who must be heard. Not for my sake, for the truth's. I ask the court's leave to call her." A rustle, a turning of heads, a soft, pleasant laugh from the front where Lavinia sat. For who could the cold Duke mean? What witness had the broken man conjured? And Sir Hugo, frowning, asked whom his grace wished to call. And the Duke of Wexmoor turned and looked down the length of the bright, crowded hall to the gray woman at the back, the woman the whole room had been taught to despise, and said, "Miss Eleanor Sinclair, late governess of this house, granddaughter and heir of the law stationer Sinclair, of 60 years standing in the engrossing and examining of legal instruments. I call her to examine that will." The laugh died, the heads turned, and Eleanor Sinclair walked up the length of the great hall of Wexmoor, through the cool, astonished stares of every soul who had decided what she was, her step unhurried, her back straight, the way she had walked in 2 years before with the wet in her boots and her chin level. And she came to the table where the document lay, and she did not look at Lavinia, and she did not look at the Duke, and she took out her grandfather's brass reading glass, the warm, worn glass that had read 10,000 hands, and she bent to the page in front of the whole watching county, and she began, quietly, to show them what had always been so. She did not gloat. You must understand that, because it is the heart of her, and the heart of the whole matter. She did not turn to the room and accuse. She did not point at Lavinia Marsh. She did not raise her voice, or savor the silence, or take, in that moment of all her moments, 1 ounce of the triumph the room would not have begrudged her now. She simply laid the truth on the table, fact by fact, in the plain, dry voice of the trade her grandfather had left her, as if the great hall were the back of a little shop, and the magistrate and attorney come in with a question. "Here is the paper," she said, "and here, held to the light, is the maker's mark woven into it, and here," she laid the mill's own letter beside it, "is the maker's own word, in writing, that this mark did not exist until 4 years after the late Duke was buried. A man cannot write upon a paper not yet made. Here is the ink," she said, and showed how it gave up its color to a damp touch as honest aged ink cannot. "Here is the seal," she said, and laid beside it the true old impression from the muniment room, and asked Sir Hugo himself, with perfect courtesy, to count the tines of the stag in each. And the magistrate bent his grave head and counted, and his face changed. "And here," she said last, laying down the estate's own paybook open to the page, "is the hand of one of the 2 men who swore he watched the late Duke sign. And here, 3 lines below, in this house's own honest ledger, is the record of that same man's death, in Jamaica, 6 months before the day this will claims his living signature. A dead man witnesses nothing. The whole of this, Sir Hugo, is a costume sewn over a corpse. It is very well sewn, but it is a forgery, and I was raised to see forgeries, and I will swear to every word of it on my grandfather's name, which is the only fortune I have ever owned, and the only one I have ever needed. The great hall of Wexmoor was utterly silent. And then it was not, because Mr. Crail, precise to the last, broke. He was a man who had kept faith with the truth for 30 years, and had betrayed it once, for fear. and he had not the constitution of the truly wicked, who can watch a lie founder and feel nothing. He sat behind his table with the ruin of his forgery spread under a governess's reading glass, and the magistrate's changed face turned toward him, and the terror he had committed the crime to escape rose up and closed over him entire. And he put his gray face in his thin hands, and he said, not loudly, in a voice the whole silent hall could hear, God forgive me. And then, it is as she says, every word, I will make a full account. I am very tired, and I will make a full account. He did not look at Lavinia when he said it. That was the cruelest thing he could have done to her, and the only revenge his broken conscience would ever take. He simply did not look at her, and in not looking, he left her entirely alone in the front of that hall, in her plum-colored silk, with the whole county's eyes swinging slowly toward her, and away from the safety of the lie that had bound them all together. Sir Hugo Pennant rose. He was a slow, grave man, but not a stupid one, and the law had been handed to him so plainly that even friendship could not pretend not to see it. And he declared the will a forgery and a fraud, void and of no effect, the estate of Wexmoor wholly and rightly the present Duke's, and the matter of how the forgery came to be made, and by whose procurement a question for the assizes, to which Mr. Crail would answer, and his grave eye moving once to the front row, such others as the evidence should name. And that was the vindication. And I want you to notice what it was not. It was not Lavinia Marsh dragged screaming from the hall. It was not a triumphant governess standing over a humbled enemy to deliver the speech the moment seemed to owe her. The villain of this story was not destroyed before the county's eyes for the county's pleasure. She was simply, suddenly, and completely displaced, left standing alone in a silence that had been her instrument and was now her judge, watching the road she had spent half a year opening. Close in a single afternoon, the solicitor who had been her creature confessing at her side without a glance for her vague brother Hector edging away from her down the bench as though her ruin were catching. She did not confess. She was not the confessing kind. She gathered the cold remains of her composure, and she rose, and she walked out of the great hall of Wexmoor with her chin up and her face perfectly pleasant, and her whole world ended, and no one stopped her, because there was nothing left in that hall she could take, and the law would have its own slow word with her in its own time. The assizes would deal with Mr. Crail, who would be transported and broken and oddly at peace, a man who had got the terror out of his chest at last. Lavinia Marsh the law could touch only at its edges. Procurement is hard to prove against a clever woman who's been careful to let a frightened man hold every pen. But the county is its own court, and it passed its sentence, which for a woman like Lavinia was the only sentence that could truly reach her. She was known. Every door she had spent her life angling to be grand enough to walk through was shut to her now, quietly, completely, forever. And she left the county within the month, and went to live, it was said, with a distant connection in a damp town by the sea, where no one had heard the story, and she could be merely poor and unremarkable instead of notorious, which for Lavinia Marsh was a kind of death, and the only justice the world had to offer. And Eleanor, when she heard of it long after, felt no triumph at all, only the faint cold pity one feels for a swimmer who has drowned in a current of her own making. But all of that came later. On the day itself, in the bright hall, when Sir Hugo had pronounced, and the county had begun its low, astonished roar, and the thing was, against every expectation, simply and irrevocably done, Eleanor Sinclair stood at the table with her grandfather's glass in her hand, and found that she did not know what to do next, because she had spent a fortnight preparing to be heard, and no part of her had dared prepare for being believed. And the Duke of Wexmoor came to her through the noise. He crossed the whole length of that hall in front of the entire county, slowly, his cane loud and unhurried on the marble, and he came to the table where she stood. And the roar fell away as people understood that they were about to see the thing they had whispered about, and he stopped before her. And he did not bow over her hand this time, hidden in a library. He took it, the hand that held the glass, in the open, in the light, before them all. And he said, in his clear, carrying voice, so that there should be no whisper afterward that could not be answered, "Miss Sinclair, you have given me back my father, and my name, and my house, and you have done it asking nothing, expecting nothing, and meaning to walk out of that door at the end of the month into a carrier's cart and a stranger's schoolroom rather than let one soul call you a fortune hunter. I know what the world will say if I say what I am about to say. I find I have spent 8 years afraid of what the world would say, and it has cost me everything but this, and I will not pay its price one day longer. I am not offering you out of gratitude. Gratitude would insult you, and you of all people would see through it at a glance. I am asking because you are the truest thing I have ever known, and the bravest, and because in 2 years in this house you are the only person who ever looked at me and saw a man, and I would rather spend my life being seen by you than admired by every drawing room in England. Marry me. Not the governess marrying the Duke, whatever they choose to call it. Eleanor Sinclair marrying Adrian Thornycroft, who would be honored past speaking if she would have him. And the great hall of Wexmoor held its breath a second time that day. Eleanor looked at him. And she did, even then, even in that, the thing that was most herself. She told him the truth. You should know what you are asking, she said quietly, but not so quietly that the room could not hear, for she would not have it whispered either. I have no fortune. I never will. I have a box of books and a black ribbon and a glass, and a name that 2 men kept honest for 60 years in a backstreet shop. And that is the whole of my estate, and I will not pretend it is more. Not to you, not to them, not ever. If you marry me, you marry a law stationer's granddaughter, and they will say it all your life, in every room we enter. I need to know you have counted that cost with your eyes open, the way I count everything, because I will not be a thing you reach for in grief and regret in the bright morning. I have counted it, the Duke said. It is the cheapest thing I have ever been asked to pay for the dearest thing I have ever been offered. And Eleanor Sinclair, 24, portionless, disgraced an hour before and vindicated now, standing in the great hall where she had been found wanting, looked at the cold, lame, solitary man who was none of those things and never had been, and felt the last of the wall she had built in 7 years of being told to want less. Come down, all at once, quietly, like snow sliding from a roof in the first warmth. And she said the truest word she had ever spoken, which was simply, yes. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the small gray church where she had once been lectured on the church path about reaching above herself, and the rector's wife sat in a middle pew with an expression of such complicated reassessment that Eleanor, catching it once, had to look down at her own hands to keep her composure, for there is no humor in the world quite so dry as watching a person who counseled you to know your place stand up as you pass on the arm of a duke. Mrs. Pelletier had to her credit the grace to be ashamed, and said so, awkwardly, at the wedding breakfast, and Eleanor forgave her without effort, because a woman who has had her own worth doubted all her life has no appetite for doubting another's, once the doubting is no longer necessary. The county, which had sneered, performed the swift and shameless turn that counties always perform. The portionless schemer in gray became, within a single season, the clever duchess who had saved Wexmoor from a wicked cousin, and the very ladies who had fallen silent as she passed in the churchyard now competed to be the first to have always known there was something quite remarkable about her, and Eleanor let them, with a level courtesy that gave them nothing to repeat, because she had learned long ago that the people who decide your worth by your fortune will decide it again the moment your fortune changes, and their good opinion was worth precisely as much as their bad one had been, which was nothing, and she did not spend a single hour of her new life trying to keep it. She kept instead the people who had been kind when kindness cost. Mrs. Dunmore, who had wept the day she gave notice to the dismissed governess and could not meet her eye, found that the new duchess remembered the weeping but also the years of cautious ration decency beneath it, and kept her on as housekeeper, and the two women arrived at a quiet understanding that was nearly friendship, built on the unspoken knowledge of exactly what each had been afraid of, and exactly what it had cost. The country attorney 2 villages off, who had kept her sealed packet and asked no questions, became the estate's man of business in the disgraced Crale's place, an honest, plodding man who never in his life made a brilliant argument, and never once in 30 years lost a client a penny through carelessness, which Eleanor valued more than brilliance, having seen where brilliance led. And the Wards, the late brother's children whose books and hours had been her charge, who had loved her in the brisk, straight way the young love anyone who is genuinely fair to them, did not lose her when she rose. They gained her, for she was mistress of the house now, and could order their happiness as she had only been able to guard it before, and she taught them still, in the long afternoons, not their letters now, but the thing under the letters, the thing her grandfather had taught her, lifting an old document to the light and saying, "Look, tell me what the hand is doing," and watching a small grave face bend to the page with the whole gravity of its years. The Duke, her husband, mended, not his leg. The leg was the leg, and he limped to the end of his days. But the thing that had walled him in, the long refusal to be seen, the 8 years of choosing cold over pity, came down by degrees over that first year the way the snow had come down off the roof, until one bright morning Eleanor came into the breakfast room and found him laughing, truly, openly, head back, at something one of the children had said, in front of 3 servants and a visiting neighbor, entirely unguarded, a man who had forgotten to manage his own face, and she stood in the doorway and watched him be happy in the open, where the whole world could see and understood that this, more than the will, more than the wedding, more than her own name made safe at last, was the thing she had truly restored, and that it had been worth every cold hour of the road that brought her there. They did not speak often of how near it had run, but sometimes, on a winter evening, with the children abed and the fire low, he would take her hand, the right hand, the reading hand, and turn it over in his own, and look at it as though it were a marvel, which to him it was, and say, "All of it, the whole of my life, it turned on a watermark, and a tine, and a dead man's wages, and a woman they sent up the back stairs to be forgotten." And Eleanor would let him hold the hand, and say, "It turned on the truth, Adrian. It was always there to be read. I only happened to be the one in the room who could read it." And that was the nearest she ever came to taking credit for the thing that had saved them both. And it was as near to the truth as makes no difference, for the truth had indeed been there the whole time, in the paper and the ink and the wax, true the instant it was written and true through every day. The county believed the lie, waiting, as truth waits, for someone willing to hold it up to the light. 2 years on, there was a particular corner of the library at Wexmoor that the Duchess had made her own, a small writing table set in the bright bay of the south window where the morning came in clean and full, and on the wall above it she had hung 2 things, framed behind glass, where she could see them when she looked up from her work. The first was the forgery. She had asked for it, after the assizes were done, and the law, having no further use for a proven fraud, had let her have it, and she had framed the lying will of the old Duke of Wexmoor, and hung it on her wall, not as a trophy, she had no taste for trophies, but as a reminder, for herself and for the grave-faced children who came to learn at her table, of how nearly a true thing had been buried under a well-made lie, and how thin the margin had been. 1 watermark, 1 tine, 1 dead man's wages, between the truth held up to the light, and the truth lost forever in a strong box. And beside it, in a plainer frame, she had hung the old Duke's true letter, his real hand, his honest, gruff love, for the son the world had pitied. The letter she had read aloud at 1 in the morning, in a cold library, to a man who could not read it himself, for grief, so that the lie and the truth hung side by side on her wall, the costume and the man, and any child she taught could stand before the two of them with her grandfather's glass and learn, in an afternoon, the only lesson she had ever truly had to give. The glass she still wore, the warm, worn brass reading glass on its black ribbon that had read 10,000 hands in a backstreet shop and one will in a great hall, and would, she had decided, read a few thousand more before she was done. It hung at the throat of a duchess now, instead of a governess. But it was the same glass, and it knew, as it had always known, exactly what she was worth, which the world had finally, grudgingly, been made to see. And on the table beneath the two frames, in a plain brass holder, she kept a single beeswax candle. And this is the part I have been waiting to tell you, the small thing that closes the whole of it. For it was the very candle from the breakfast table of her first cold morning in that house, the one that had burned thin and gray beside her on the day the great staircase looked her over and found her wanting. She had asked Mrs. Dunmore to find it for her, that first stub of wax, and Mrs. Dunmore, understanding without being told, had found it, and Eleanor kept it on her writing table and lit it sometimes in the evenings when she worked late, and watched the small living flame she had once watched her own still reflection in, and remembered the 24-year-old woman with 11 shillings and wet boots and nothing in the world but a glass and a name, and the one true thing she knew herself to be. And she did not pity that woman. And she did not pretend to be grander than she had been. She only lit the candle and let it burn, and went on with her work in its light. There is a thing her grandfather used to say, the thing he left her instead of the shop, the thing she had repeated to a duke in a cold corridor, and would one day repeat to a grave-faced child at a sunlit table. And it had been, when he first taught it to her, a small dry rule of a small dry trade. A hand always tells the truth. She had carried it for 7 years as a workman's tool. She understood it now, at the end of all of it, as something a great deal larger. For it had turned out to be true, not only of forgers and downstrokes and the pressure of a pen, but of a whole life, that what a person truly is will out, in the end, in the unconscious grain of the thing, however the world dresses it, or buries it, or counts it at nothing, that a portionless governess kept honest, and a lame duke kept solitary, and a frightened solicitor, and a patient cruel cousin, had each, in the end, been read for exactly what they were, by the slow, patient light that reads everything eventually, whether there is a glass in the room or not. A hand always tells the truth. It had been the smallest thing her grandfather owned, and it had turned out to be the largest thing he could have left her, and she had spent it well. And so we come back, as these stories must, to the foot of the great staircase where it began, where a gray woman with wet boots once stood, and let a bright house find her wanting. Except that the woman who stands there now, on a bright morning 2 years on, stands there as its mistress, and the house does not find her wanting, and the candle on the side table is lit by her own order. And the only thing that has truly changed in all of it is that the world was finally made to see what was true the whole time. Which brings me to the question I always leave you with, here in the quiet, before the candle burns down on the tail. Because Eleanor Sinclair was offered, more than once, the easy road, the safe small life, the kept head, the wrapped glass, and the closed mouth, the carrier's cart away from a fight that was not, strictly, hers to have, that she could have walked away from with a clean conscience and a written character, and nobody the wiser. The whole world counsels that road. The whole world rewards it. And she did not take it. She stayed and gathered and stood very still in the cold water for as long as it took, and held the truth up to the light in a room full of people who had decided she was nothing. And it cost her nearly everything before it gave her everything back. And there was no guarantee, on the gray afternoon she chose, that it would give her anything back at all. So I would like to know, you who have stayed with me to the end of it, When you are the gray figure at the foot of someone else's bright stair? When you hold a true thing in a world that has agreed on a comfortable lie, and the easy road is right there, with your character written and the cart at the gate? Would you keep your head down, and your glass wrapped, and your small, safe life honestly held, the way the rector's wife counsels, and the whole world rewards? Or would you stand very still in the cold water, for as long as it takes, and hold the page up to the light, and let it tell the truth, whatever it costs you? Tell me gently, in the quiet, which one you would choose. I would like to know who is out there in the dark with me, holding their own true thing, up to their own small light. And so the candle burns low on another tale. Stay a while in the quiet, and tell me, if you will, whether she chose rightly.